it's time for a wrap-up of everything that I read in February. I'm really excited to share these with you all, and I'm gonna do this list in the date of publication order, not in preference order really at all. So let's dive into the first book, which is actually the only book that I read that fulfills my goal of reading more books of my TBR, to be read list from the early 20th century. This book is Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons. It's published in 1932, and it's a strange little book. It's a parody of British rural life in the 1930s, and most people find this quite funny. So it's about Flora. She's an orphaned young woman who has thoroughly modern sensibilities, and then she goes to live with her country relatives who are gloomy and gothic, and there's a huge contrast between these characters, the types of writings that these kinds of characters normally show up in, and it's baffling to me personally. I think others smooth this over. I understand this is a parody, and I really don't think I'm refined in the appreciation of parodies. The contrast between Flora with her modernness and her gothic relatives is just so dissonant to me. So while I didn't personally find this very amusing, I'm sure most other people would. So let's jump ahead to the publication year of 1994. I read Foreigner by CJ Cherryh, who's an author who I've been meaning to read for quite a while. She's been writing sci-fi since the 70s, and Foreigner is actually the first book in this huge series that's like 20 books long now. This book is a first contact story. Our main character is Bren. He's a human ambassador living amongst the Atevi and has a fairly quiet life until someone tries to assassinate him, and then we are in the dark. Bren spends so much time just wondering what the heck is happening, knows just as much as the reader does, and it kind of reads as a thriller at first, but then quickly becomes repetitious as we spend most of the book with Bren agonizing over his situation. Like, seriously, so much agonizing. It's a fairly interesting character study of Bren, and we get these really interesting anthropological explorations of like an outsider trying to understand an alien culture as Bren tries to understand the Atevi, so we've got interesting themes there. So though my stated criticisms about spending a lot of time with Bren agonizing aside, there is a lot to recommend the book from the world and the world building, the anthropological themes, and the psychology of both Bren and the Atevi. Now moving along to some books that I really loved from my childhood and reread this month. First is the Squire and Lady Knight books by Tamora Pierce. So Squire was published in 2001, Lady Knight published in 2002, and these are the last two books in the Protector of the Small series, and I love them so very much. Our main character, Kel, is one of my favorite leading ladies, and in the third Protector of the Small book, we follow Kel as she's a squire, and she works in this really awesome squad. And then in the final installment of the series, we follow Kel as she battles these magic killing devices, and she goes up against those while also upping her leadership skills. It is so very great, and I really appreciated Kel's story so much more than I did the first time around, and I think I actually like Kel's story better than Alana's story. Alana's the original Lady Knight, and she's really great, but there are two main reasons that I really liked Kel's story better than Alana's. The first reason is that while Alana hid that she was a girl working on the boys to achieve their knighthood, which was necessary, Kel is openly a girl working amongst boys in this male-dominated field, so we have a very different dynamic there. And the second reason is possibly a spoiler. I do not think it's a spoiler at all, but if you're sensitive to spoilers, I'm going to put my hand up and scrub through till when the hand goes down and the spoiler will be over. So the second reason that I really liked Kel's story is that while Alana is a lone wolf kind of lady knight, Kel works in teams, and she even becomes commander material, which I don't think the fact that she becomes like a commander is really a spoiler, but in the interest of sensitivity to that, hand is up. So she has to learn to command the respect of these men who are very grudging of the fact that she's amongst them, not to mention that she's trying to lead them. And so I love this dynamic of her learning to be a commander Lady Knight, not like just a solo Lady Knight. So spoiler or not spoiler is over, and I really enjoyed rereading this Protector of the Small series, and it was actually surprising. I don't remember loving it as much as I do this time around. I have a much deeper love for it and for our beloved Kel. As a bonus, these last two books in the series were quite emotional. Hit me in the feels, and I shed many a tear, both sad and also happy. So I also reread another book from my childhood. It is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix by J.K. Rowling, published in 2004. And I love the Harry Potter books so much, so I obviously loved rereading this. I just wanted to mention that I did, in the interest of completion of telling you everything I read in February, but I don't actually have anything original and new to say about the series. I just loved it. Now let's talk about some nonfiction books I read this month. One is Life is Meals by James Salter and Kay Salter, published in 2006. And in this, the literary author James Salter and his partner Kay put together this foodie companion book. It has culinary history and culture and recipes, and the way it's structured is that there are entries for each day of the year, and the entries are sometimes themed around historical events, sometimes they are not. It's a fairly informal and cute book, the content of which is hit and miss. So some entries are really fascinating and some don't seem to be fact-checked, so the whole book is best taken with a grain of salt. And that pun is very much intended. The other nonfiction book I read is The Fire This Time by Jesmyn, published in 2016. And this book was inspired by The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, which is a book that I read last month. And this book has essays that are inspired by James Baldwin and talk about race in more in a contemporary way. So the pieces, they're so powerful and talk about race in America, and they're equals to Baldwin's work, and I actually think they might be even stronger pieces. These resonated even stronger with me, probably because they speak more to my own time, and there's examples from my own time, which is right now, contemporary. So I definitely recommend this piece. It has a lot of strong works within it. I'm not going to talk about anything individually, but it's just, they're really thoughtfully done, and it's a very powerful piece of work. Moving along to another book published in 2016, I reread one of my favorite books of all time. It is Two Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer. And I haven't quite found the best way to talk about this book, but one recommendation is that I've read over 1,000 books, and this is in the top 20 of my favorites easily. We have here a hard-won utopia of the 25th century, and it's grappling with ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment period in a very heady discussion of philosophy and religion and politics. This world has evolved past nation states into global, non-geographic citizenship. It has these hives of philosophically like-minded affiliation. And the whole world, it's tied together with flying cars that it may travel faster and safer than ever before. It is so fast that you can travel halfway around the globe in 3 hours or so. This book has a lot of like societal things that are really interesting culturally, particularly around gender and religion. So the book starts with our main characters discovering, no matter how improbable it seems, a boy who can bring inanimate objects to life. And alongside this, we have also a narrative arc of high politics in the hive system. First and foremost, I love this world so much. This is some of my favorite world building in all of science fiction. This is original and fresh, thoughtful and deep, and even optimistic mostly. Like, the breadth and depth of this world is so astoundingly good, and even though you can see the inspiration of the other literature, you can pointedly see a philosophy and history that you might recognize, this book is still very much its own. It is very original. And admittedly, I have to warn you that it is a challenging read, from the style of the writing to the density of ideas, but I think that if you give it your attention, the payoff is huge and worth it many times over. And this makes it sound like it's so much work to read this book, but I think it's thoroughly entertaining too. And so I might be the oddball in this opinion, but I do think that the book is a page turner. I absolutely love this book. It blew my mind, and I am also probably just like in love with this book. It is so very good. This month I also read Gnomon by Nick Harkaway, originally published in 2017, though I think only published last month in America. And this is a dense and intense work of science fiction. We have a surveillance world, and in this, Inspector Neath investigates the death of Diana Hunter, who died during what might be called a mind-probing session. So her investigation takes her into the recorded mind of Diana Hunter, and improbably, Diana Hunter's mind also contains the minds of a banker who is the chosen one of a shark god, also a kidnapped alchemist who is shown something that should not exist, also a old man refugee who designs a radically provocative video game world, and lastly, a sociopath about whom I'll say no more words because spoilers. So this plot has layers under layers inside layers, more layers go sideways and deeper, and there's lots of wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff going on. It is a long, dense, demanding read, and it blew my mind a dozen times over, which I kind of grudge it for, but it's all good. And this book at 700 plus pages is a long one. You really have to be ready for that long haul, but if you like the wibbly wobbly plots, then this is a fantastic book. I also read Sinless by Sarah Tarkoff, which was published at the top of 2018, and I technically finished this mostly because it's a very, very short, fast-paced book, but it probably should have been DNF. I did not finish. So I'll just talk about this quickly. It's set in a world where those who act morally are blessed with physical beauty, and then those who act immorally suffer horrifying physical consequences. The main character is a well-behaved cleric's daughter, and she stumbles upon information that complicates the good versus evil narrative of this world. And this is a YA dystopia that has snappy writing, so very snappy, and it has very short chapters, so the pages just fly by. And disappointingly though, the main character is just one of the weakest elements in a kind of barely interesting narrative. I think I would only recommend this to hardcore YA dystopia fans to just give it a try. And lastly, I read Markswoman by Rati, Mehrotra, which was published in 2018, just a few weeks ago actually. This is a YA fantasy, and it's a really cool original fantasy world where we have these warrior sisterhoods of Markswomen, and they protect the people in the land of Asiania. Our main character is Kyra. She's a young Markswoman. She takes down her first mark, and simultaneously dangerous powers are rising in Asiania, including that there's a dangerous woman who takes control of Kyra's order of warriors, and this puts Kyra on the run. So I like the world building in this book, but it does happen at the sacrifice of more plot happening. So this is mostly a setup probably for what's going to actually happen in the rest of the series. Also, beware, there is a YA love triangle. Cue audience groan. But once that's out of the way, the characters do more interesting things. So I like this book well enough to finish the first volume, but I think I'm leaning against continuing on with the series. And that's this month's wrap-up. If you want to follow along more with my reading life, I post about the books I read on Instagram, and I even post over there about a lot of the books that I DNF, especially if I've gotten far enough into the book that I have something interesting to say about it. So that's been interesting because I don't talk about books I DNF on camera, so it's cool to write about it and share my thoughts over there. Anyway, happy reading. Until next time, lovelies.